Sacred Heart is proud to sponsor Pensacola Histories in recognition of the Daughters of Charity who brought their mission of care to Pensacola over 90 years ago.
Hello and welcome to the continuing story of Pensacola, North America's first place city. Today we have the continuing story of Pensacola's fishing industry, commercial fishing, and we began this several episodes back by talking about the arrival here almost simultaneously of men with capital who were, number one, had created the railroad from Pensacola to the north, and secondly, had begun the manufacturing of ice, commercially made ice. And with the availability of railroads and ice, it was possible for adventurous men who were already in the business to come south from New England and begin commercial fishing. And we talked about the original fisherman, Mr. Sewell Cobb, and how he developed his operations here on Palafox Pier. And of course, Cobb was followed in 1880 by Andrew Fuller Warren, and then 2 years later by E.E. Saunders and Thomas Wells. And those three companies together were the nucleus of the great fishing industry, which by the time we reached the year 1900 had about 800 employees on a more or less regular basis. It was a $500,000 industry per year, which in $1,900 was a lot of money. And this industry was providing table fish, snapper and grouper and things of that kind for markets to the north in Cincinnati, Louisville, Chicago, and then a little bit more to the west as time passed into the area of Kansas City. So it was a big industry and was moving very well by the time we get to the year 1906. Everything seemed to be going just beautifully for them. And then in 1906 they ran into a problem. One of the vessels of the Warren Fish Company was working away just off the Mexican shore, supposedly beyond 12 miles, just off Campeche. And a Mexican patrol boat came out and seized the boat with all of its crew, brought them back into port, and put the men in jail, and by telegraph advised the owners of the Warren Fish Company of what had happened, that these men had violated Mexican coastal waters. Well, the Warren Fish Company didn't believe this, of course. Their men had been very carefully instructed. They were using modern charts. But Thomas Wells took ship, went to Mexico. They argued long and forth, back and forth. It took quite a lot of diplomatic haggling on this. The local diplomatic head, Mr. Tunison, went down to assist Mr. Wells, but finally they got the group released. But this made international news because by now the Mexicans, of course, were becoming much more protective of their waters. They didn't want the Americans coming down there and fishing out all of this wonderful snapper ground that they had there. Well, this episode with the Mexican government had just barely ended when a terrible hurricane struck Pensacola. This was the hurricane, of course, of 1906. Now, we had suffered a serious hurricane 10 years before. And from that storm, the United States government had stepped forward and finally created what we now know as the United States Weather Service. So by 1906, there were better warnings, better provision for this. But nonetheless, the storm of 1906 was devastating. And there are some wonderful pictures that show what had happened on the lower side of Pensacola. This was when, of course, fishing smacks themselves were just lifted out of the water and thrown aside. Great inventories of lumber that were on the docks ready to be loaded for shipment to Europe. They were destroyed and scattered about. And of course, one of the classic stories we had, there was a vessel in port at that time, a commercial vessel, not associated with either fishing or lumbering, that was literally thrown on her side. It was a classic British vessel, a sailing ship, and there was at the time it was a question of whether it should be repaired. It was so badly damaged, but it went back, and it later on became quite famous in British naval history. And it, of course, is a vessel that many people know about today, and its name was the Cutty Sark. But that was all part of the 1906 hurricane, and this is basically what had happened at that point. The fishing industry was improving. But now they began at this point to use what we would today call more modern marketing techniques. And in 1910, our local Chamber of Commerce decided that there was an opportunity to make our industry even larger. And so at this point in time, they put together a whole trainload of cars of nothing but iced down snapper. And they took these cars, about 10,000 pounds of them all together. They took they had the car put on a special train and was dropped off in Montgomery. And the Chamber of Commerce stood there, members of the Chamber of Commerce stood there through a good bit of a morning, literally giving away samples of snapper. Now, apparently it didn't work too well because they never repeated it, but the idea was this was something, again, that the local newspapers picked up and had a wonderful time with. Well, as we move forward through the 1920s and so on, the fishing industry continued to improve. The volume was great. I failed to mention, however, that one of the important things right at the turn of the century came as Mr. Cobb, of course, had grown older, and he had sold his interest to the E.E. Saunders Company, so that as we get into the teens and 20s, we have only the two enduring fishing companies, the Warren Fish Company and E.E. Saunders. Through the 20s, they did well. Everything went on just fine. And then we came to 1929 and 30, and of course the Great Depression hit fishing just as it did everything else. The cost of operation, of course, went down, but the problem was that even though they could catch the fish less expensively, and there were plenty of men who wanted to go out as fishermen, at this point in time, people in the cities to the north didn't have the money to buy the fish, and so of a consequence, it was a very, very difficult time for the industry as well. So by 1939, the United States government was somehow or other had gotten interested in this, and they were making a series of surveys of all kinds of industries to see which ones could be improved to create more employment. And this survey team came to Pensacola, looked at all of the vessels. They literally surveyed them, looking not just at what they were or where they were, but what kind of condition they were in. Were they going to last a long time? Was the future bright for them? And they identified 14 using fairly modern fishing smacks that were in good condition, and they were the property of these same two companies. Well, a little over a year later, of course, war began, and at that point in time, the demand for fish just absolutely escalated. We needed it for the armed services, we needed it as a substitute for other meat, and the need for the product was there, but then, of course, the Saunders and Warren people had a new problem. Now, with each passing month, it was harder and harder and harder to get men, because the able-bodied men, of course, were being drawn into the military services. It was at this point that a rather unusual thing began to happen. They changed the techniques of the fishing itself so that the voyages were shorter, and they began to use older men, people who were basically retired but who still could handle a hand line. And Francis Taylor told the story that basically that they would go from place to place, literally recruiting people who didn't want to work in a factory or anything like that, but kind of enjoyed the outdoors. And this was basically what they did through the balance of the war. We came into the 1950s. Well, we could say at the balance of the 1940s, and the industry has pretty much settled back to what it had been before. And now we came into a unique situation, and I have no explanation for it. In talking with both Frank Wells and Francis Taylor years ago, it was difficult for them to put their finger on why this happened. But the men who were on their vessels were being well paid, and unfortunately they were not wise. They were not good stewards of their money. These men, for example, how this would work, you see, a vessel would go out, spend its 20 to 30 days on the banks, would come back, and of course what they would do is as the vessel came into port, they would have the catch weighed. They would know the number of pounds of snapper or grouper that they had, and this of course was multiplied out by the going rate for a pound of such fish, and then you had a gross capital share to be divided, and each one of the members of the crew got a share. And basically, a captain might draw about $175 to $200 for his work, a mate slightly less, and the average crewman would make $80 to $90 a voyage. Now, that was fine, except that a lot of these men, well, they were single, they had no responsibilities, and they would start right out, and they would go to the place where the cheap wine was available, and they would literally drink up their take off the voyage very quickly. It was that scene which prompted a recently arrived young minister who had just come into the area to look at the scene and say that something has got to be done about this. And we don't have time in this episode to talk about who he was or why or how he actually did it. But basically, it was from what he saw among these fishermen and a few of the deep sea people as well, that he put together a team, and with the help of Captain Benny Edmondson, one of the local waterfront icons of the area, they created what we now call the Waterfront Rescue Mission. These people were the men of the were being literally picked up out of the weeds, almost senseless from drink, and they were put on hopefully on the road to some kind of recovery. Well, we move into the 50s. And slowly but surely, the industry changes. The vessels, which originally had been totally sail-powered, now most of them anyway, also had internal combustion engines, so that voyage out and back could be made more quickly. But with each passing year, two things were beginning to happen. I take this story directly from Francis Taylor, who was kind enough to share it with me some years ago. As they moved into the early part of the 1960s, it was becoming increasingly expensive to handle a shipment and a movement of fish. The wages demanded by these people had to be greater than the shares that they had drawn before, and there were other opportunities for employment here, and people said, well, that just isn't what I want to do. And then going beyond that, of course, maintaining the ship, the smacks, was becoming increasingly expensive because they required more. There were new governmental requirements on the safety aspects that had to be placed there. And as a result of that, the cost of a voyage going out and back was increasingly difficult, and the railroad rates were going up in shipping the material. And so by the time we get into the early 1960s, E.E. Saunders and Company, the surviving sons, decided to close it down. They transferred their operation into the handling and sale of frozen foods, and so E.E. Saunders did continue to exist downtown. In fact, where their fish house is today a brand new building that is operated, among other things, by Merrill Lynch. They still call this area the Fish House. So the Warren Fish Company continued on for another 5 years. Francis Taylor did everything that he possibly could to supplement the income of the company, but year by year by year, their net became smaller and smaller. They suffered one or two unfortunate accidents, which did not help at all. And so by the time we get into the year 1965, Francis Taylor said, well, the time has come. The demand is great, but we just can't make money doing this. And so the Warren Fish Company was the last of the three great ones to close down. And so the great industry ended. Now, in the course of all this time, of course, others had come into the business. One young man who had joined and had worked for both Saunders and Warren was a young man from Italy named Joe Patti. Joe Patti had arrived here he had come to the United States right after World War I. He came south just shortly thereafter, got a job with Warren, and then with Saunders was a partner, not a partner, but a captain with them both. And then ultimately he went into his own business as a shrimper and became extremely successful at that. And of course, the story of Patti's Fisheries, the Williams Fish Company, and others, all of these were part of the local scene, but step by step they began to decrease as well as costs went up and the opportunity for making a decent profit on it decreased. The Patties moved in a different direction. They continued in the shrimping itself. They purchased shrimp from others. They put together a wonderful seafood market on the waterfront. And about 25 years ago, one of the sons, Frank Patti, went into the building of not only fishing boats, but also great liners that are still in use on the Mississippi River as gambling vessels. So the Patti family is still with us. Their store on the waterfront is one of the major tourist industries, or tourist stops for people coming here to view our city. So fishing, well, we can say that it began in one way or another with the first colonists. It continued as a major industry, but then by 1965, I think we can say we wrote fini to the fishing industry as we knew it, and that was its story.